good morning, everyone. So today is a little interesting. A good friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, somebody that I look up to a lot, has decided to join me on the podcast for today. And so, you know, it's a good podcast when you talk to somebody and the first words out of their mouth were, I feel like I was just getting started. Like there was so much more I wanted to talk about. So I'll talk about that in a second. For right now, I just want to give some context as to where we are. We're about 3 weeks out from the presidential election. Things are just angry right now, really angry all the time and about everything. Right now, there's this very weird hatred of Chris Pratt on Twitter. He's the worst Hollywood Chris, is I think the way that it went. And his co-star stuck up for him, which I thought was good and appropriate. But the basic reason is because he doesn't get super political. And because he holds himself to Christian values and some other stuff. And Twitter has gone crazy over it. Twitter has said that he's, I think the worst one that I saw was, and I didn't look very hard for very long, was I hope Chris Pratt had a terrible week. He deserved every bit of it. And a lot of these people aren't even explaining why. It's almost just like a need to hate people, like to have somebody in contempt. And it's a very odd time. And I don't think that's good. And I appreciated that his co-stars kind of said, look, leave him alone. He's a good guy. Like he's a good guy. And I think, anyway, that's one thing that happened. Another thing that I'm going to reference obliquely because I want to be careful of young ears that might be listening, is that somebody got in trouble for doing something that they shouldn't. And I can't tell which is worse, the fact that he did something that was wrong and bad, or the Twitter mobs that are trying to string him up by his toes. And like it'll come up when I talk with my buddy Jason. But it just feels like there's something wrong with the Twitter mob too, if I can say it that way. Anyway, let me tell you about today's podcast. So for a while, I've been writing a little piece that I had initially called a conservative challenge, a challenge to my religious conservative friends. And the idea behind it was that I wanted to say, I'm religiously conservative and you should be, if you are too, if you're a Trump-supporting evangelical Christian or if you're a Trump-supporting member of my own church or whatever it is, here are some of the things I think you should believe because this is how my faith influences my politics. And so it was things like the Constitution, right? And how we, in the military, they take oaths to the Constitution. They don't take oaths to the president, and for very good reason. And one of them was peaceful transfer of power, no matter what happens this November. And by the way, I do believe those are things that religious conservatives should believe. And I would challenge people to say that we're not going to engage in political violence and some other stuff. But the more that I thought about it, the more I started thinking about the times when I've actually changed my mind during my life or when I've learned something from somebody else. And it was very rarely when they were trying to push me and when they were trying to challenge me. Most often, it was actually when I was kind of an incognito anthropologist. So I had the fortune of going to a Catholic school when I was in middle school and high school. And I went to Mass, and nobody really thought that you went to Mass to learn anything. You went to Mass because you had to. But I was this weird religious geek that really enjoyed religion generally, and so I would go and I would learn a lot. And the reason was because I knew that they weren't talking to me, and so I could still listen and get something out of it. And so I really enjoyed Mass, actually. I thought it was a really fun experience. To be clear, I'm still not Catholic, but I think that you can take something away from an experience and say, what's the most I can possibly learn from all of this? And so that was kind of the goal there. And so as I thought more about this, I decided that perhaps a better way to frame this was, instead of me saying, here's what you should do, to say instead, here's what I intend to do based on what my religion is teaching me. And I've had for a long time a number of people tell me that, your podcast is okay, I guess, but it'd be a lot better with somebody else on there. And I agree with that. I think that that's absolutely true. So I invited a friend of mine on because we were talking about this on Marco Polo recently. So two things about that. First of all, if you would like to come on this is literally just me talking. And it's actually a lot more fun to talk with somebody else. Forces me to shut up a little bit. So if you have an interest in a topic, please feel free to reach out to me. A couple of you already have, and I've kind of thought in my head when I can fit you in. I think it's a lot more interesting to hear from more than one perspective. Second, Jason is my friend that I'm going to talk to in just a second. He was my first mission companion, so he trained me. He's somebody I've looked up to for a long time, and I think you'll see why. He is just a decent guy. He thinks very carefully about the things that he says. Now, part of that is because he's just a really thoughtful, introspective kind of person. Part of that is because he's active duty military. And so we tried to stay away from some of the hot button issues. In particular, he'll talk about this. He has obligations not to talk about sitting members of the government of any kind. And so you may feel like we're treating things a little bit carefully. That's on purpose. I don't think that's wrong necessarily, but if you wonder why we're not kind of going gloves off, that's why, and I think that's probably for good reason. The other thing that I would say, and we say this as we discuss, but I want to say it explicitly here, neither his opinions nor my opinions represent those of the military, because he's active duty military. They don't represent the views of the church. They don't even represent the views of this podcast, because the podcast is completely different. This is just Ben talking about some ideas, some things that have been in my brain for a little while on the topic of how my faith influences my politics. I also want to add, I promised him that I would shut up and let him go we recorded pretty early this morning, and I told him that I would let him go, and because he had family prayer to say with his adorable family. And as soon as I was done, I stopped the record button and I just said, "Hey, how was that? Was that okay?" He said, "I feel like we were just getting started." There were things we talked about that I didn't get to clarify. There were things that I wanted to go more in depth on. There were it was good, but I so wish that we could just go back and do more. So we may do more at some point, but if it feels like there are things that I wish we could keep talking about, that's what comments are for. And to be clear, I don't think there's one right answer to how your faith should motivate your politics. In particular, we avoided the tribalistic stuff. Like, well, my faith tells me that we should be responsible and personally responsible, so that's why I'm a conservative. Like that's not super helpful right now. Instead, we were trying to be, I think, a little bit more nonpartisan. And that doesn't mean that you can't have partisan opinions. It's just not what we were doing. I would love it if people listen to this podcast and say, here's one way that my faith pushes me to be a better person in the political sphere. I think that that's a really powerful thing. And by the way, I'm certain that I have some atheist friends. Your ethical worldview certainly counts. I don't want anybody feeling left out with this. How has your sense of ethics or your worldview about other people pushed you to try and become something better, or to view politics in a different light? And it's almost certain that people are going to disagree, and that's fine, but I think it's a really valuable conversation. Now, I also say this, but I want to say it more explicitly here too. It's literally just two guys. And if I had my druthers, I would interview people about this for the next 3 months, especially members of my own church, because I'm really interested by it. Like, how does your faith influence your politics? I think that's a really fascinating question. I want to emphasize that because it's just two guys, it's a very limited view. And you shouldn't assume that every member of my church believes as I do. But the conversation is worth starting, and it's worth saying, like, how has it pushed you? And I end with this thought at the end of the podcast too. I think if your religion isn't pushing you to become a better person in ways that are somewhat hard, you're not actually you don't have a religion, right? You have a fan club, and it's not that your religion is changing you; it's that you picked your religion. And I think those two things are very different, right? The prophets always get killed in the Old Testament because they're saying really unpopular things like you need to repent, you need to be better. That's kind of the job, right? That's the role. The role is to say things that people don't want to hear so that they can become better. And so I tried to think about things that everyone needs to hear right now, but also things that push me. Like, well, I guess you'll hear. So with that, I will shut up. I will get out of the way, and I'm going to let Jason start by introducing himself, and we'll go from there.
Hi, morning, Ben, and to all the listeners out there. So, quick introduction. My name is Jason Walker. As Ben and I will discuss, we were companions on the mission. Currently, I'm serving in the U.S. Air Force. I'm a pilot for C-130s. That's cargo and transport, for those not familiar with all the military designation, and also top pilot training. I married 4 children, grew up as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in California, a little town called Tehachapi, about 2 hours north of LA. And my parents joined in 1980. As we'll come through in this discussion and is relevant, my father is Black, my mom's white, and that will obviously I have a different lens, I think, than some members of the church. Not better, not worse, but I think that will definitely play in as some of our topics come up and is relevant to how some things are interpreted. So, um, yeah, grew up in California after school. Went to the Air Force Academy for 2 years, then served a mission there in Houston, doing Spanish speaking, and then came back, graduated with the Air Force Academy. I've been in the Air Force for now, 13 and a half years, roughly. And I'm currently down here in Montgomery, Alabama area at a thing called Air Command and Staff College, and we're learning about military operations and strategy and how it applies beyond just the tactical employment of an aircraft or a smaller unit to now how we work on the kind of the national level. So,
and some of this kind of started because we just started talking about. I think that the exact phrase was, "Oh my gosh, you get to take classes in which you talk about things like that. That sounds like absolutely fascinating." And I'm sure you're not like totally thrilled to go to class every day. Like it's class and it's homework, but it's like that's a really interesting topic. And so we were talking on Marco Polo.
Yeah, it's a good break from the grind of daily military operations. So, but yeah, we're reading, depending upon the week, 350 to 500 pages a week. That's on the high week, and then discuss everything from war theory to leadership. Currently, we're discussing the roots of air power and how you employ airplanes in warfare, and some of the early ideas. So, yeah, the idea is that after this, a lot of us will go on to staff jobs that maybe with the other services, and be able to articulate how to use air power properly. That includes aircraft, how to use space power, how to use cyber power. All those kind of fall into the purview of the U.S. Air Force in various ways, and how to use them for greater effect. And also make sure they use ethically, which we have lawyers for that. Obviously, there are lawyers everywhere. But if you look at the history of, wars is a very terrible thing, and in the effort to achieve objectives, sometimes actions are taken which are not moral and ethical, and how do we avoid those while still achieving an objective which is good for the nation.
And it's such a hard thing because it's war, right? Like it's not going to be pretty. It's not meant to be pretty. It's meant, it's really hard. And at the same time, how to you know so much more about this than I do. I'm going to fumble even trying to talk about it. Like war without any norms is still worse than war with some norms, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. The fact that you're taking human life is terrible. You're just, there's always destruction, and on both sides, there's always bad things that are done. What I've appreciated too, the school, is the fact we're able to be critical, that, there is an idea that, the military is all of one thought because we follow orders, but we've had discussion about how the U.S. has messed up in the past. So we've taken actions which were not correct, which were misguided. And that's important, regardless of the world stage now where news is global in an instant. Just the simple fact of right and wrong. There are times we have not acted justly as the U.S., and that's good to acknowledge.
I think that's spot on. So you neglected to mention we were companions, but you were my trainer.
Yeah.
And so I still occasionally will pull one of my sons over to me, and in my best Elder Jason Walker voice, say "mijo," because that's what you used to call me when I was a young baby missionary and you were training me. So where this idea came from was I've wanted to have some other people on for a while. Every time that I have other people on, it seems like my show's a little bit better. But the second reason was I had written a little thing that was kind of a challenge to religious conservatives, and it didn't quite feel right because making a challenge to other people doesn't feel like the right way for me to articulate what I think. And at the same time, I feel like it's really important to get out there the way that my religion informs my politics. And so we were having a conversation the other day. We were actually talking about General Conference, which is when the leaders of our church kind of give us some, sermons and some talks about the kind of way that we should live. And it struck me that this would be a much better way. Instead of saying, here's how you should live, it's here's how we try to live, right? And to be clear, and I want to start with this, nothing that you hear today is officially from the church. It is the perspective of two dads, who are living, very different lives, but are also trying to be the best Christians that we know how to be. And I think that now is a really good time. We're right before an election. I see a lot of not super great conduct out there and not good political conversation. And that, I think, is at the root of this idea of civility and radical civility. At the same time, I think that there's also, I think there's an opportunity here to learn some things about what our religion informs about, and we typically think about only moral issues, right? We want to talk about hot button cultural war issues, and I don't think that that's it. There was a talk there was a news article a number of years ago now, probably more than 10 years ago, on the Mormon newsroom is what it was called at the time. And it was called the Mormon Ethic of Civility. And that is absolutely part of where all of the civility stuff comes from. And so talking a little bit more about that. So with that, I want to reiterate, this is not the official position of the church. It's not even the position of anybody other than the two of us. And I think if you surveyed 100 Catholics about how their faith informs their practice, you would get 100 different opinions. And it's the same thing here, right? This is a very limited conversation. But I do think it's a worthwhile one. And so when I post it, I hope if people are listening to it, that they feel like they can say how it informs their politics, and that's fine. I do think our goal is to stay away from, well, it informs my politics to be a Democrat because, or it informs my politics to vote for this candidate because. It's a little bit more general than that. And so with that, why don't we kick it off with, how do you feel like, there have been some recent messages in particular, what are the kinds of things that are most on your mind? And I figure we can just kind of go back and forth and talk about one a pop.
Sure. And also, thanks for that disclaimer. I'll do the same, because nothing I say represents the position of the Department of Defense, the U.S. Air Force, or U.S. Air University. So again, this is the opinions of Jason Walker and of no one else. So,
I appreciate that. I'm sure that our 5 listeners will be.
We're really, also taught that, legal's important. So
yes, absolutely. Well, and I appreciate it. And my disclaimer at the end, I think I will remember to include it, but if I don't, these are just my opinions, nobody else's. So with that, what is, give me one that you feel like your faith has taught you, that is something that you are supposed to do that makes you a little bit different in the realm of politics.
I think I was rereading President Oak's talk as preparing for this discussion, and his talk from the last conference was "Love Your Enemies," and I think how that informs me, and has always informed my general interaction in politics, is how do you interact with the other side? How do you approach someone who has a differing opinion? And it's allowed me to have, I think, a more patient and deliberate interaction with others who have different beliefs, because I can then seek to know what they learn, and then maybe, while I may not agree, at least be able to hear what they have to say and then state a point that's to the opposite. So
I think that's exactly right. I feel like President Oak's there were probably 3 main parts of his talk that I can remember off the top of my head. I guess 3 bullet points in my summary. One is, we have to be kind to everyone. Like, we don't have the option to do otherwise if we're trying to be Christian. Second was a really thorough denunciation of racism. And I think the third one is, it can be hard in a democracy when we don't win and we don't do violence. That's just not something that we do. We wait instead, and we hope for a better outcome next time. But we have the obligation to eschew violence and to call it out. And I would actually extend that, because I think this is even more important. One of the things that I've seen lately, and I think the way that I would say this is, I think David French is a writer that I quite enjoy. And I think he said, we have an obligation to follow the 9th commandment and to not lie or bear false witness against our neighbor. And he lumps in a lot of things. He lumps in, you're not allowed to exaggerate the evils of the other side, or to talk up your own side, or say how good you are, or point out flaws in the other side and minimize your own. And so I think that that's part of this, this whole idea. And for me, we have to live the 9th commandment. We have to be honest. But in particular, it means we don't minimize the mistakes of our own side. And I think that goes in particular to violence. And so as I'm looking at, I don't really have a side, which is kind of nice. I'm politically pretty homeless. And so it's very easy for me to just say, like, we don't need political violence right now. It's not a good thing. And there's, there's a line there I think everyone would have to cross of, like, at what point would I take up arms to defend my family? And I think that's, I want to be clear, there is that line somewhere. I don't know where it is yet. It's still far off. But right now, the threat of political violence, if my candidate doesn't win, is really frightening to me. And I think it was very clearly said, at least for us, that that's not something that we'll engage in. When I initially wrote this episode, the biggest thought that I had was to challenge my religious conservative friends who support Donald Trump, that if they believed in the Constitution, that they needed to really push for a peaceful transition of power. And that there may be claims of unfairness. There may be claims of, that didn't go the way that I wanted it to. But I think it's really important to set out now what would be unfair and how that would look. And we have institutions that would rectify that. We have the courts. We have traditions and norms and other things that can say, here's how we're going to figure out whether it's actually a fair election. But what we don't do is engage in political violence because our candidate loses. Sorry, I kind of went way off course a little bit to talk about. I actually am remembering now when I was a missionary and I went way off course in a lesson and you said, that was good. Now, can you bring it back?
That was good. And I gave a very general, be kind to each other. Yes, but a substantive issue. But on that note about, with elections and so forth, one aspect that I think is important, and people who've watched news as military members, we swear oath to the Constitution and not to any particular person. But at the same time, we have certain rules called the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and we're prohibited from expressing direct insults or criticism at sitting members of the government. And there's a good reason for that. You don't want the people who have all the weapons to start swaying the politics, or as we've seen other countries, to rise up. And so at the same time, we still walk a balancing act of being politically engaged. We're encouraged to vote as military members, but also we remember that the president, regardless of party, is our commander in chief, and we respect the office, but we are obviously free to vote as we see fit as members of the military. So
if I can ask, and this is a little bit of a deviation from our topic, but I have felt in the last little while, I felt a little bit like freedom of speech has been, how do I say this? I'm not advocating for anybody to limit freedom of speech in any way. I think it's one of our core protections, and it's incredibly important. My thought, though, is that in the name of freedom of speech, people are really nasty. And I think freedom of speech means you should be allowed to say things, but that doesn't mean that just because you can, you should. I'm thinking of the meme that it had something to do with, I think it was candy corn flavored Oreos or something like that. And the meme was you never stopped for a second to think just because you could, whether you should, right? I feel like there are a lot of people out there who have gone too far in the wrong direction of just constant criticism. Twitter is a really nasty place. I should say it can be. It can also be a phenomenal place of learning and networking, and there's a lot of good that can come from it. Has the pendulum swung too far, right? Like, is our political discourse too negative? I'm embedding my answer in the question. I'm giving you here's what I think and why you should say that I'm right. But do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, especially coming from the military, where you're not allowed to speak in public about certain things. Do you feel like that constrains you in good ways or bad ways? Anyway.
I'd say, first of all, from a social perspective, I've noticed that over the last 20 years, I feel like the rhetoric just there's like a pendulum that keeps swinging further and further to each side. Or maybe a better example is sine wave that just gets larger in magnitude. Because I remember, starting from, especially with the Iraq War, you had some very angry rhetoric, and without getting too off track, the Iraq War had deserved some very serious criticism. But over the time from President Bush then to President Obama, it felt like now once you had a Democrat in office, well, people on the right said, okay, well, now it's our turn to be very angry and outspoken. And yeah, I've seen it get, I think, just more vociferous over the last 20 years. And it's disturbing to see, to the point now where, people can't even talk to each other, or they unfriend somebody because they have different views. And it's one thing to have such a strong perspective, right? That you feel some moral indignation when it's violated, but it's something else when someone has a different perspective than you simply can't even associate with them. That's not what I think our founding fathers wanted. You look at some of the ideas that they had early on, and they came from very different perspectives. They're able to associate, and yes, they had some very colorful and even divisive arguments. And it's not to say that it's never been in politics, but there's still, I think, a bedrock American quality is that we're able to be of different political parties and perspectives and still be neighbors. And that's what differentiates us from other places where you have a lot of civil strife. As far as the military, we definitely have some limits on our free speech. As we say, we support democracy. We don't always live it. And so there's reasons for that. It hasn't always been perfect, and as you've seen in the news, there have been times when military officials have come out and said things that they shouldn't have, or others felt they shouldn't have. and even inside the ranks, there's the military does tend to be fairly conservative for various reasons, and some of that good, some of that bad. And so there are times where I think inside the ranks there could be probably a little more discussion on that. But I think as times have changed, also I've seen that has altered a bit. You've seen different, become a little more less homogenous, excuse me. And so different perspectives coming in the military, different laws have changed. We say we're a cross section of society, in most part we are, and in some ways we are. But if you look at even just the racial breakdown of, say, officer versus enlisted, it's not proportional to society. Particularly in aviation, for example, what America's approximately, say, 12% Black, and so that definitely is not the case in the flying world. And so that does, I think, lend itself to different perspectives. And so it's been an interesting discussion, and there are times I think where in private people have said things that probably were not appropriate in small groups, but we learn and grow. We're human beings, and we try and remember that at the end of the day we're still wear the uniform, and we need to be respectful and go forward in a way that represents the uniform. So I think the biggest place, and people can call out, is like on Facebook, is where military members have made statements that were simply not appropriate, and you can get called out, and you can get highlighted too by leadership.
It's a real thing. So even in your personal, on Twitter, on Facebook, there's still limits on what you can say.
I mean, absolutely, because it's a public forum. We've seen how someone can screenshot a tweet and send it around, and someone says, "Oh well, Army Colonel so and so or Air Force Major so and so said this." It doesn't matter the fact that a major's not very high in the military structure. A military officer said it, and so it can have implications. And so there's that responsibility. And people have gotten in trouble for saying things they shouldn't have on social media. Because again, as a military, we were officially bipartisan, nonpartisan. You saw that especially with General Milley, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's had to walk a very fine line of, here's where the military stands. Yes, we support the government, but we are not part of the politics.
Right. All right, so let's get back. That's fascinating, and I want to ask you a bunch more questions about that. But let's get back to faith and politics for a second. I feel like one of the ones that I want to talk about for a second is when I was growing up, I thought that calling people brother and sister was just cool and great and totally normal. And then I did it in front of a friend who was not a member of my faith, and it was very clear that it's super weird. It's like not normal at all. But in our church, we have the tradition of calling, I'm Brother Pacini, and my wife is Sister Pacini, and that's just kind of the terminology. I used to kind of be a little bit embarrassed about that, and the longer I've gone in life, the more that I've started to realize that I actually think that quaint little habit that we have is actually a very powerful answer to some of the problems that we face, right? In at least a couple of ways. The first one is that, and I think that there's a lot in this statement that I'm about to make that I think has been talked about in talks and sermons and preaching for many hours, but that is that everyone I ever meet is a child of God. And that means that he cares about them. That means that they have potential. That means that I don't get to resent them or hate them or have contempt for them, because they are somebody who is beloved, and that they matter, and that their life is precious, and that all of those kinds of things. And I think that's one way in which, and I'll be blunt, right? I remember before going on my mission, having a conversation with some people about immigration, and my political views shifted a little bit, but my human views, I would say, shifted a lot. When you're working with a group of people, and I want to be clear that I'm focusing on those human views. Like the people that I worked with in Houston were primarily immigrants. And what I started to learn really quickly is the political views are important, and we should think through those. But you have to be able to think about these people as children of God and your brothers and sisters. Another way of saying this is, like, your political opponents are not just your opponents, they're also your countrymen, right? And more importantly, they're your brothers and sisters, right? And I think that forces, well, and to be frank, even the people that we fight in a war, right? If we have to, are in fact our brothers and sisters, and that we have to do everything we can to seek for peace and those kinds of things. So that's one that has been on my mind, is this idea of identity and being children of God and brothers and sisters.
That was a great point. Getting into actual policy, immigration one too, where I'd say I softened. I think growing up in California in the '90s, there was attitudes and jokes that were not kind toward especially Hispanics, and the attitude changed when on the mission, seeing how they were people who just want to get a good living. I remember we met folks who had worked 2 and 3 jobs in the U.S. trying to support their families. I still would like them to come legally, but I understand why they come. And also, having done more research, I know our immigration system is broken. And if we believe that part of this life is not just to be tested, but also to grow, there's an opportunity to allow those who want to come here to America, that despite all our flaws, is still an incredible nation where you can do a lot with your life if you choose to. And so there should be ways to allow people who want to come here to work and contribute to do so. And I think our system is not built properly, or has some serious flaws in it that need to be addressed to allow more people to come. And then, if we're going to make this a little more interesting, from the partisan side, it is interesting to see this shift in discussion. The right has become, in many ways, or let me phrase it, there are many on the right who are loud about being anti-immigrant. That is not to say all on. It's not fair to say that everyone on the right is, but you look at some things that happened during the Reagan administration. There was the act of amnesty, I believe, in 1986, and now you say that as a Republican, and it's almost asking to lose your seat.
Yeah.
Why is that? Are you really going to deport 12 million people? I mean, so I mentioned I fly student 30s. I do logistics. You want to talk about moving 12 million people? That's going to be logistically impossible. It's just not feasible. It's not realistic. And so there is that question: how do we address that? How do we incorporate them into our society as our brothers and sisters? How do we afford them opportunities? Do you do things like those that get in, they're allowed in, that came in illegally, do never get to vote? I don't know. That's something that has to be hashed out. But how do you? Because at the same time, we believe in fairness, we believe in justice, and there are those that have put their names in the line and gotten in, and it'd be unfair to them in some ways to simply put others ahead of them and to cut them off. That they come to America because many are escaping unjust, corrupt countries, and there's an element of betraying that system, I think, when you do that. So there's a compromise that has to be made. So immigration, where I think unfortunately there's been a lot of lost opportunity, and we go and then we say in the name of quote unquote law and order, but is it, how much also is it simply wanting to enforce a policy that doesn't really benefit people? So my own personal opinion, sometimes there are positions taken up maybe with some principle behind them, but also because it's the opposite of what the other side believes. I
was actually going to say, I feel like one of the problems that I have with the immigration debate is I think there are people who disagree with me, and I am now pretty liberal on, I should say, I am in favor of immigration liberalization. And I think there are people who have a different view than me that are principled and thoughtful and kind and compassionate. So I want to really put that out there first. I also think that there are people on the other side from me who are willing to exploit fears and are willing to otherize and to say that immigrants are undeserving, or to build contempt or fear or whatever it may be for those people. And that to me is not Christian. That is not an acceptable kind of a thing. I think, I think there's nothing wrong with trying to take a principled view. I think what you said was perfectly right, which is there's an issue of who, I've been in line this long. I've been trying to go through the right channels, and now you're letting a bunch of people ahead of me. That doesn't feel fair. What do we do with votes? What do we do with welfare programs? This is not a super simple, easy to unpack thing. At the same time, I think that there are ways in which we can be decent, and we can try to have this conversation in a thoughtful and principled way. The next one that I have about 2 or 3 more, and so jump in if you have one that you want to share.
We're gonna let's just go deeper.
Go. Yeah.
All right. So obviously the church got a lot of attention for our stance with the LGBTQ community, and that has been an evolving relationship. We do have our doctrine that families will exist after this life, and they're made up of a husband and wife. At the same time, our stance, and not just ours, but a lot of times in Christianity, I think has been used to justify behavior and treatment that is not Christ-like, not appropriate. I really have been impressed by how the church interacted in a lot of ways with the LGBTQ community. Things like fair housing and employment, and rights to go visit people in hospitals. So in fact, a good friend of mine who's he's a little more left. He's more left to center. We have great discussion. He's also been impressed by that, because it's we do have our doctrine. We're not going to change that, and our perspectives on that. But it doesn't mean we can't be kind to them. And some feel that those two are they're not mutually exclusive. Basically, they feel because we do not support gay marriage, well, clearly we hate the gays. That's not. I think it's unfair. I see why they say that, because they feel we're limiting their opportunities for happiness as human beings. I respect their position, but I disagree. I can have good interactions with someone who is gay, and and we can be coworkers, we can be neighbors, we can be friends. We do disagree on that, and that's fine. And it's not something that we fully understand in terms of how does one have experienced same gender attraction, and that's not necessarily our role. Is to be kind. It's to stand for what we believe, but we can do so without being hateful. And I think there's been a lot of missteps by people on the right, and I think unfortunately it's been done in the name of religion, and it's partially what has driven many people away from Christianity over the years. Is that the way we conduct ourselves? We say one thing, that the person we follow teaches love one another, and then we treat those who don't live up to our beliefs and standards a different way. So it's a hard topic, but I think it's one that we could do better at as a people.
I think I have, as I'm thinking through kind of in the archives of my brain, I have never been in a position where I felt like my religion was telling me to be unkind to somebody because of their orientation, because of their identity. I cannot think of a time when I felt like I was fearful or uncomfortable around somebody because of their identity or orientation. I just, again, and I want to be clear, for some people it can feel like, well, you say we should love them, and okay, I understand that there are probably still people who are not loving and kind, and they need to be called out, right? And I understand that, and to be fair, I think that I would, I err more on the side of calling people out and giving consequences, because I'm an assistant principal at heart, and so I'm very willing to say, that was wrong, that wasn't Christian. Right? Like you don't get to use a slur and make fun of people. You don't get to call people things that are awful and then say, well, it's because of my faith. And when that happens, it needs to be called out and denounced pretty strongly. But I think you're exactly right. I think that there's sometimes an attitude of, I like the way you said it. We have our doctrine. I don't see any indication that that's going to change. And part of our doctrine is that we have to love everyone as though they are children of God, because that's what we believe that they are. And our doctrine also focuses a lot more, in my mind, about the family and that the way that it's structured. It's a lot less about other things. But anyway, I appreciate that thought. One of the things that I think, turning to one that's been on my mind lately, is that there's a pretty rich, I almost call it a mythology, and I want to be careful because it's not mythology to us, it's scripture, right? It's stories that we believe in really deeply. There is a lot of discussion in the scriptures about seeking for a more just world. And one of the stories that I like a lot is this idea of Zion, of the ideal society of making a world better. Now, I know that some of my friends are already rolling their eyes because it's very utopian, and that's absolutely right. But it's a society that's built on personal behavior, not on government rules, right? It's a society that's built on, I do the best I can to be as Christian as I know how. I repent for myself instead of pointing my finger at politicians and blaming them. It's a society that's built on loving your neighbor and being kind, and the kinds of things that we're talking about here. And so I do want to be clear, as much as we talked about political violence earlier, and I do think that's important, I also think that we have an obligation to seek for a better world, and that we have an obligation to live up to the ideals that, in kind of a Kantian way, if everyone in society was being like we are, what kind of world would we live in? And we have that obligation to live up to the best kind of society in that way. And I think that's a really important point. So anyway, just wanted to mention that really quick.
Well, I think it's an important point because we started off talking about political rhetoric, and you mentioned how sometimes this is directed to those on the right, and I'm right of center. I think I've come more toward the center over the years, but the point I'm getting at is that we should consider how we interact with others. You mentioned the scriptures, and a lot of times we look at the scriptures, Bible or Book of Mormon, we see them directed toward other people. But if you look at a lot of the sermons, they're actually directed toward the followers of Christ and toward the church. And some of those calls to repentance, to be better citizens, are meant for those who claim to follow Christ, because there is an example to be upheld. And this is a time, I think, when we see so much division, that we have a responsibility to maybe ask, like, am I part of the problem or am I part of the solution?
Yeah.
What does my post on Facebook communicate? What am I saying on Twitter? What am I liking? What groups am I supporting? And there's a responsibility there to consider what impact we have, because as individuals, we, especially in the modern world, we have a lot of impact, a lot of influence, and more than I think we realize.
You said something, and this is one that I'm going to sneak in my next one really quick, because you hit on it so perfectly. I think we have an obligation to show other people grace. And I've thought a lot about the moral humility involved in that. Right now, there's a Twitter storm raging about somebody who did something that they shouldn't have done. There's always a Twitter storm raging about that. And it was interesting because I saw people making the argument of, like, so-and-so did nothing wrong, or so-and-so, this is all just people joining in a mob rage. I was like, yeah, those two things are very different, right? Somebody saying they didn't do anything wrong is very different from saying maybe we should back off. Maybe they did do something wrong and also we should back off, right? Maybe they did do something wrong and they need the consequences, and those consequences are going to be taken care of. And there's no good to come from a mob being whipped up into a frenzy and attacking somebody on Twitter. It's morality on the cheap. It's the easiest thing in the world to say, look at me, I'm so moral because I'm calling out this person who got embarrassed, right? Or frankly, did something wrong, okay? I think in my mind, and I want to be clear, it needs to be consistent grace. It can't just be grace for your side. It can't just be grace for Republicans. It can't be just grace for people who look like you, right? But I was thinking about this earlier today, and the thought that came to me was the story of the woman caught in adultery in the New Testament. We always think of that as a story of compassion and mercy for the woman involved. I wonder now if it's not actually a story of condemnation for the mob, for the group of people who are surrounding her, who are trying to attack her, and him saying, no, don't do that, right? And I think that there's a message in that we have to show grace, because we have to recognize that we're not the judge, but also that there is something really bad about a group of people being whipped up into a frenzy and all getting ready to cast a stone when they know that they're not perfect either. So I think that's something that's been on my mind.
I think definitely part of that story. You mentioned mobs getting whipped into a frenzy, and again, look around the world, and there are various historical cases where if you can sow enough division, you can have some pretty terrible things happen. I mean, everyone knows, of course, the Holocaust example, but even so, one of my elective course this term is African security in the 21st century. And there have been some very terrible conflicts in Africa. Some due, of course, to colonialism and its impact, but some due to tribal strife and racial strife. Some of that also a result of colonialism, but nonetheless, different groups that, if you can get people divided enough in any part of the world, human beings will find a way then to unfortunately do some things which are deplorable. And so, as I mentioned in one of our discussions on Marco Polo, the conflict that killed the most Americans was the U.S. Civil War. We are our own worst enemies, and we are the ones that can cause our own destruction. So yeah, that civility is key. And it also cuts across lines, across racial lines. And this is a bit of a segue, but in the discussion of love and of equality, I think it's also important to recognize that's not one way. And some would say, well, of course, that's obvious. But I remember, in being a minority, I think I maybe hear some other perspectives that don't get viewed. I've had discussions with friends of different races, like, man, I hate white people. It's like, whoa, okay. I don't think that's very productive. And yes, the history of this nation is very open, and we're learning, though, some more things that have happened over the years that are very deplorable. But the holding on to the past and allowing that to engender feelings of hatred, I think is counterproductive, regardless of what race you are. There's discussion. I've heard some say that racism is only if you can affect the system to impact the other race. So essentially, that if you're a minority, you can't be racist because we lack the political power. We won't get a lot of time in discussing that particular definition, but either way, it's still prejudice. And I think if you act out of a sentiment of prejudice, it makes you no different than the person that you are, to whom you feel feelings toward. Again, whether, and even coming from a historical perspective, again, there's been terrible things done in this country over the years that were racist, that can cause one to be quite angry. A lot of people in this nation could probably be a lot farther ahead if we had changed some policies over the years. I'm here in Alabama, so Montgomery was the first capital of the Confederacy, but also, of course, the heart of the civil rights movement. And so there's talk about a juxtaposition of two movements there, but it's important to see that here in the South, I think a lot more progress could be made if things like the missteps of Reconstruction and the Jim Crow laws hadn't happened. How much human potential was lost during the time of discrimination, when children could not get proper education or families could not get proper work. And so I think some of the maybe the economic struggles here are a result of that history. In the racial discussion, it becomes easy for some to say, well, those people are just lazy, or they're not smart, they're not motivated. And then others say, well, they just get focused on history and won't let go of the past. The past does have an impact. That is certainly true. And I've come to really appreciate that more, getting to spend time here in the Deep South. I've spent most of my career, I've been in Oklahoma and Texas, most of it. So I've seen it, but here in the Deep South, you really get to learn some history and to appreciate that. And if we really want to move forward, it takes the ability to forgive those who committed the offenses, and also to not have those attitudes, if you're a minority, to not have that attitude to hate white people, because it doesn't make anything better. Now knowing the history also can help educate people, that, hey, there's been some bad things done, but also what are some of the things that folks don't recognize that are racist. And I think that's part of the issue, that folks who don't see it or experience a lot, going back to the church, I think people say, oh, there's not a lot of racism. Well, it's simply because they don't personally experience it. It's not because that person's ignorant or that they're denying it. They don't see it as much. And so I think part of the responsibility is pointing out, hey, this is how it occurs, is when it occurs. And I think when it's pointed out, most people are going to say, yeah, you know what, that is wrong. And it simply takes that effort of pointing out where it occurs to then move forward. We're more similar than we think. And I don't mean, I mean humans in general. We tend to be more alike than we'd like to paint ourselves. And when we can come together and have discussion, we may be a little bit, on different sides of an issue, but a lot of times we're able to, I think, come to a conclusion on the same side.
Well, I think I hear your timer going off, because you have family prayer to get to for the morning with your kids before they go to school. And I also think the idea of personal repentance and unity, and the way that I'm going to stop before I butcher something beautiful that you said, and let it end on a good note. But thank you for joining me today. This has been really good. Let me just end with this one thought. I don't think that there is one way that our religion should motivate people to vote. I don't think that there's one way that it should motivate people to act. But I do think that if you have a religion that doesn't inform the way that you act in ways that can challenge you a little bit, then your religion isn't worth very much. If your religion only tells you things that you already believed, then it's not changing you into a better person. It's just reaffirming who you always were to begin with. And so these are things that have been on my mind, and I think that I hope that they're helpful, but I want to be clear, these are aspirational. I am not perfect on Facebook. I am not perfect when I argue with people. I'm not perfect at being kind or anything else, but these are aspirations that I have, and I think they're the right ones. So with that, thank you so much, like I said, for coming. Let's see if I can remember it without looking. Radical Civility is written, produced, and edited by Benjamin Piccini, and the views expressed are only the views of myself, not my faith, not my family, not my employer, or even myself when I am older and wiser. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ben.